Hello, my favorite quilters. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a continuous bias binding. And first thing you need to know is how many inches of bias binding you need. And your pattern should tell you that. If not, you take the width times the length, and that gives you a number. So for my project, I need 220 inches. So I went to a website called gettasquiltingstudio.com, and she's got a chart that helps you. Not really a chart, it's like a formula on how you figure out what size of a square you need to start with. So, and the formula is, you know, if you've got your cell phone handy, because you've got to figure out a square root. And it's been a long time since I had a math class, but let me tell you. So I take 220 and I multiply that by 2.50, because 2.5 inches is what I'm going to be cutting my binding at, and that equals 550. Then I need to figure out the square root of 550, and it's really simple. On your phone you've got this little thing here that's got different symbols, so it's going to show you this is the symbol for square root, and I put in 550 and I press equals, and that's the square root, which is a funny number, but you've got all these, you know, after the decimal point, and all you do is you just round it up. So instead of 23, I'm going to start with a 24-inch square. That's what I would do, and that's going to give me approximately 220 inches of bias binding. So I wanted to see if you understood that part. Now, I'm going to be using a smaller square just to show you what I've done to get this. So this is a 13-inch square. First thing I'm going to do with this to make this continuous bias binding, you have a 45-degree line on your ruler. And so I'm just going to, it's like I said, it's a 13-inch square, and I'm just going to cut it in half on the diagonal. And there we go. Yay. Okay. And I'm following my notes because sometimes this gets a little tricky, but it's pretty easy once you've done one before. Okay, when we make the bias binding, there are only two seams that you make on the sewing machine, and this is the first one. It's, again, sewing, when I had it, it's these two triangles together, and we just want to do a 1/4-inch seam. It's only a 1/4-inch seam, so I always like to finger press it first, just to see if you can get it, because you want this to be as flat as possible. So I kind of separate it out, and we're just gonna give it a nice little press, and then I always like to flip it over and give it a good press on the right side. So the next step is you've got this cut, and you're gonna, on this bias edge, we're gonna measure out 2.5 inches, and this is gonna be a cutting line. So I use a pencil. You can use, because this is, you know, it'll be in the seam allowance, and you wanna, and you can see that's a little light over there. And then I'm gonna do another at 2.5. All the way to the edge of the fabric, and we can do one more. And this part of it is like excess, but this is the part that gets a little bit tricky, freaks people out, but it's not that big a deal. But you're going to take and put a pin in a 1/4 inch from exactly where you want to. You remember, it's going to be one more seam, another 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going back to the lines that I've drawn, and I'm eyeballing what a 1/4 of an inch is. You can actually get your ruler out if you need to. So you have this tube, and this is what it kind of looks like. And like I said, it's a little confusing, but you're going to be amazed when we're all done here. And we're going to start cutting right on that cutting line. You cannot use a rotary cutter because you're cutting a spiral. So we've just got to cut all these out. And when you need a bias binding when you're working on, like if you've got a circular quilt, you need that flexibility of a bias binding. And if you have, there's some people that have made quilts that have scalloped edges, and to get that binding to lay nice and flat and look pretty, you need to have a bias binding for that as well. And even if you've just got like rounded corners, like I make pot holders, and those rounded corners, with having the flexibility of a bias binding, it makes it look, it just lays a lot flatter. You can stretch it and bend it easier. Okay, we're almost done here. And that's our excess right here. We can just use a ripper and rip that out. But if you look at this, you've got a 2.5 inch bias binding. And again, you'd go back here and press all these seams open. If your tube is big enough, like I said, I used a smaller square to start mine, but when I started with like a 24-inch square, I was able to take that tube and put it at the small pointed end of my ironing board, and I could lay it flat and I could press that before I did the cutting or whatever. But it's all done, and then again, you press all these seams open, and then you just go and do your binding like you do regularly. You fold, you know, on the fold, and it's ready to be used.